In our last two lectures, we examined the illiberal tradition, the tradition of Nazism and of communism. And we contrasted that with the liberal tradition. And we drew a distinction and stated in the shortest possible terms, the liberal tradition, the tradition of Winston Churchill, the tradition of the Declaration of Independence, insists that the individual is preeminent and that the freedom of the individual to live under ordered liberty, to live as he or she chooses, as long as he or she does not harm another, that is the essence of the duty of government, to secure that freedom. The illiberal tradition says the individual is subordinate to the state or to the party, that the individual ultimately exists only as a part of the state or party, and that the liberty of the individual can only find its fulfillment in the state or the party. Now, this concept, this illiberal tradition of liberty, stands in the most fundamental contradiction to the great notion of civil disobedience. Civil disobedience, which is a foundation of the liberal concept of freedom. Now, during the war in Vietnam, the United States was engaged in a war against communism, it is true, but a war which also made it an heir to the colonial tradition of Britain and of France. One which said, yes, we are a democracy, but we should rule over other countries. And secondly, it was exporting our ideal of democracy and defending it at a very time when we were denying fundamental rights to an important part of our population, to a significant part of our population. And for many at that time, this represented a hypocrisy. An hypocrisy that led to a degree of civil disobedience with few precedents in our country's history, and ultimately to a most fruitful change within our country. It is interesting that books and ideas frequently exist long before they become part of the ordinary currency. And such was true of Henry David Thoreau. Long before the Vietnam War, long before Thoreau became a staple of reading in undergraduate courses, he had influenced others, we shall see, like Martin Luther King and Mahatma Gandhi. But he only became popular with the Vietnam War. And in many ways, Thoreau's own situation reflected those who felt a conscience during the Vietnam War. For those during the 60s, we were engaged in a colonial war and a degree of hypocrisy towards our own black citizens. Thoreau in the 1840s felt this same call of conscience. Henry David Thoreau was a man who went his own way. He attended Harvard, but he was not captivated by the discipline of learning. He read the classics, he read Plato's Apology, he read the Antigone of Sophocles, and found their deeper meaning, which was to put into action through his life fundamental principles. And so on July the 4th, 1845, he would go out to Walden Pond and begin 2 years of life in simplicity, making his own actions the statement of his message. And he was living there when the war with Mexico came. And for Thoreau, this war with Mexico, like the continuing existence of slavery, was a repudiation of what the United States was supposed to stand for. It was a repudiation of the Declaration of Independence, of those unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He would spend a night in jail for failing to pay a poll tax, and in 1848 he would give a lecture which was then published as an essay in 1849 on civil disobedience. Civil disobedience. That concept that the individual owes a higher loyalty to his conscience than to any state. Now, years later, after the Second World War, during the trials at Nuremberg, high officials of the Nazi regime were put on trial and asked how could they have carried out these crimes against humanity. They argued, you have no right to try us whatsoever. These are ex post facto laws. They didn't even exist when we were carrying out our actions. But more than that, we were perfectly within our rights because we were carrying out our duty to the state. We were following orders. This evokes a long tradition. It evokes a tradition at the very heart of Christianity. St. Paul had said, the powers that be are ordained by God. Resist not evil. Make yourself subject to these powers. And Martin Luther had quoted this same passage. The Christian is utterly free in his soul, but in his exterior, he should be the dutiful subject of the state. Even an evil ruler is put there by God. So your ultimate duty is to obey the state, whatever it tells you. Well, Thoreau had seen the evil inherent in this idea. He starts off in his article on civil disobedience by saying that, as Jefferson did, I believe that government is best which governs least. But I think you ought to push that to its final conclusion. That government is best which governs not at all. To see government as it really is, look at a bunch of soldiers. He could have looked out to the steppes of Russia and seen the SS. Put ordinary, decent men in a uniform, give them a gun, drill them, and they will do anything, no matter how wrong, that the state tells them, because it is their duty. Now, do not tell me that a government like ours, which rests upon majority rule, is always good. The majority means nothing. It can be nothing more than the institutionalization of evil. After all, it was a majority that put Socrates to death. And in a state in which the majority is doing wrong, the only place for an honest man may be in jail. And Thoreau spent his night in jail. But at the same time, the individual, even if he is alone, even if nobody supports him, must stand up and act on the basis of what he or she knows to be right. And so, even the paying of taxes for a government that you know to be wrong is an act of evil. Our government right now is doing something wrong. It is invading Mexico in a colonial war, and it is supporting slavery. It is supporting fugitive slave acts. These are wrong. Wars of expansion, wars that are not for self-defense are wrong, and slavery is just wrong. And so, I will oppose it, even if I am a minority of one. But Thoreau went further than this. He questions the hypocrisy of a society around him. You know, he said, simplicity is freedom. Our possessions are the fetters of our despotism. I look at New England that prides itself on its Puritan simplicity. But in fact, you judge someone by the clothes they wear. Simplicity in life, cooking your own food, these are all the marks of a truly free individual. And going out to Walden was his statement of achieving his own internal freedom. But you know, you cannot just passively sit by and allow wrong to be done. Civil disobedience is not passive non-resistance. And so Thoreau welcomed and championed and supported John Brown. This was a man who did something against slavery. And towards the very end of his life, Thoreau would write essays and even thought of a biography of John Brown. Because rather than just complaining about slavery, this man had armed himself. He had gone out to where the evil was, first at Kansas and then at Harper's Ferry. He had armed men and fought against evil. He came from good Puritan stock, Thoreau said. He is the descendant, in his figurative way, of Cromwell, of those who stood up against evil and know that ultimately you may have to take up the sword. And in the most prophetic way, Thoreau said, they hanged John Brown. He was like a martyr. He was like a Socrates. He went to his death knowingly, calmly, knowing that the sins of this land were such they could only be purged by blood. And so he will never die. His truth will go marching on, Thoreau said. Powerful words, written in what was a backwater of the world by a man who achieved little worldly success. But ideas, as we have said in this course, make history. And it was in a jail in South Africa that an Indian, Mahatma Gandhi, would read the Civil Disobedience of Thoreau and see in it a focal point for his own mission in life. This Indian lawyer would grapple with the question of how can a great democracy like the British Empire deny basic rights to its citizens? And why should a man or a woman, because of their color, be denied the equality of freedom? Gandhi was born to a moderately well-off Indian family. They pooled all their resources in order to send him to England to study law. He arrived with a fair knowledge of English and studied the law and tried to assimilate himself to English ways, wearing English clothes for a while and then going back to India, where he wasn't very successful at the law. He was too timid to speak. And then he was sent on assignment by a company in India to look after its interest in South Africa. And there, on a cold night, he was thrown off of a train just because he had dared to buy a ticket to the first class section and sit there. The conductor came, and we're in the year 1893, and said, "You got to sit in the third class compartment." He said, "I have a first class ticket." And a passenger said, "I want that colored out of here." And Gandhi said, "But I am an attorney, and I tell you I have the right to sit in this car." And the passenger said, "There are no colored attorneys in South Africa." And Gandhi said, "Well, I can show you that I am admitted to the bar at London, and since you say I am colored, we must assume there's at least one colored attorney in South Africa," and was promptly thrown off the train. But this gave him an insight, a mission about the promise of freedom in the British Empire that was not realized. By law, every subject of that empire was guaranteed the same rights, but they were simply ignored and legally violated. And so Gandhi began what he would call in his autobiography, "The history of my experiments with truth," his search for truth. And he would be led in his search for truth by Tolstoy. He would cite Tolstoy's book on the kingdom of God is within us as one of the most fundamental of influences. That Jesus is a great man, but not God. That Jesus is a model to us, that we must live with simplicity and love towards our neighbor. Do evil to no one, but at the same time to resist evil. John Ruskin was another important influence upon him. He learned from Ruskin that the good of the individual must be expressed through the good of the whole. And public service became Gandhi's mission. The public service of bringing freedom and rights. And Ruskin taught him that a barber deserves the same salary as a lawyer. Both do the same work. It is a different kind of work, but their labor is the same. And then finally, that a life of simplicity, that the work of a farmer or an artisan is the most satisfying. And so like Thoreau, he found in a life of simplicity a statement of a mission. And so in South Africa, he would begin to lead a struggle for recognition of basic rights. Why should Indians have to carry passes when white British subjects did not? But how to do it? How to do it in the face of the greatest empire in the world? And he found the lesson in Thoreau: civil disobedience. Civil disobedience. And he taught those who increasingly flocked to him in South Africa that they should not do any active violence to their oppressors, but not allow their oppressors to punish them. March along. And if your oppressor beats you as they did, don't strike back, but don't run either. Let them beat you and beat you and beat you. And so resist their evil. Thus Gandhi found what he called the great truth. He was profoundly a Hindu and found much of his influence in Hindu thought. Every day as he shaved, he would read from the Bhagavad Gita, another Hindu sacred text. He would frequently have the name of Ram, the Hindu divinity, upon his lips. But he defined all religions, Muslim, Christian, Hindu, all of them as moving towards one central truth. And he would write, God is, even though the world deny him. Truth stands, even though there is no public support. Truth is self-sustained. Truth is the most important name of God. It is more important to say that truth is God than that God is truth. And every day let us take this resolution. I shall not fear anyone on earth. I shall fear only God. I shall not bear ill will towards anyone. And I shall not submit to injustice from anyone. I shall conquer untruth by truth. And in resisting untruth, I shall put up with all suffering. What noble words, and how nobly put into practice. And Gandhi would return in 1913 to India to take on the greatest of challenges, to make the British Empire recognize the freedom of India, because he had come to understand that the British Raj had no moral authority. It was hypocritical. And why should they rule over Indians? Indians should find their own way. And in fact, Gandhi wrote his autobiography in his own Indian language. He adopted Indian clothes. He pushed the doctrine of vegetarianism to its limits. Because you see, to conquer untruth, you must first conquer yourself. You must conquer your lust and your desires. He became a voluntary celibate. He would eat not only no meat, but he stopped eating cereals, legumes, no lentils. He took a religious vow never to drink milk. He fasted every Monday, and that same day spoke with no one to allow him to refocus his energy. To practice this doctrine of simplicity, he opened up communes in India, where the young were educated. Educated, first of all, in their own Indian languages and to appreciate their Indian culture. He said, I didn't know some of the languages I was supposed to teach because my students and their parents came from all over India. But I had a grammar and I went along with it, and the students and I worked together. So first their own heritage before they learned the way of the English. Simplicity. He began to spin his own fibers. Why should India grow cotton, send it off to England to be made into garments, and then buy them back? Let us begin to strike at the English by their economic heart. I am not opposed to machines, but I believe we need to see the simplicity in life. To not be caught up and made captives of all the technology that surrounds us, to think somehow technology is our Savior, instead of our Savior being within ourselves and our own search for truth. And so he would take on the British Empire. He would lead marches in which his followers would be beaten. He would go to jail. His wife would die in jail. But he would continue his search for truth. And it involved all Indians. From the very outset, he had wanted to bring Muslims and Hindus together. The Quran is as beautiful as any Hindu scripture. Together we love. And so when outbreaks of violence occurred, he would go to Muslim villages, Hindu villages, and step by step, with great events like his march to the sea to collect salt, like his stirring fast, his not eating for days on end in order to bring public attention to wrongs, he gradually brought down the British Empire. Yes, Britain was weak after the First World War. The British had lost their will to rule India, but this single individual played a key role. But what he could not do was make Muslim and Hindu stay together. And the partition of India in 1947 was a brutal blow to him. He had preached the doctrine of ahimsa, of nonviolent resistance. He had spoken of being strong in the truth. And surely the truth could hold India together. But it split, and terrible violence occurred. Bloodshed on a horrifying scale. And so Gandhi, old in his 70s, would walk from Muslim village to Muslim village, stay in the homes of Muslims, and then go from Hindu village to Hindu village. Or where the two were combined, stay in one house of a Hindu and then a house of a Muslim. He would fast to make them come and understand and love together. And in the end, knowing that assassination lay within reach, that he would soon die, walking to his prayers one day, was shot down by a Hindu fanatic, the 30th of January, 1948. But his message was not confined to India. Just a very short time after that, it would be read by an undergraduate at Morehouse College in Atlanta, bearing the noble and significant name of Martin Luther King, Jr. His father had been a minister. King, a brilliant student from the very beginning, chose Morehouse College. Receiving a fine education, discipline, he had as a classroom assignment to read Henry David Thoreau. And you know, every time I give an assignment and I say, well, 99 of the students are not going to like it or care about it, I always believe, based on Martin Luther King, that one will learn from it. And he found in Thoreau a powerful idea. An idea that said, even if I am a minority of one and something is wrong, I should stand up for it. And I don't care what the law says. If it is not found in natural law, then it is an evil law. And then he heard, as a theological student, Crozier Seminary, a lecture on Gandhi by the president of Howard University, who had been in India. And King described it as an electrifying experience. That this man was so powerful, Gandhi, in the pursuit of truth. And that his standing up for truth through this non-violent resistance brought this great empire to its knees. He would go on to Boston University. We can share his intellectual odyssey, reading Reinhold Niebuhr, and coming to understand that there is an evil in human nature. Men are not by nature good. They're not by nature evil. They have both in them. And he saw in Hegel the ability to form a synthesis by which you draw upon the good in men and ultimately come out with a tolerant, even loving society. But you must resist evil. Reinhold Niebuhr had said something like the Nazis must be resisted. And Thoreau had said John Brown was right to stand up and fight. But King decided that he would follow the path of nonviolence. When he graduated from Boston University, he had 7 academic offers. But he chose to go into preaching. Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery. I like to think of this as, in a way, like Jesus. He is coming out into the world. He could have had a safe, secure academic career, but he went out into the world and preached. And there he was. In 1955, when Mrs. Rosa Parks decided to get on a bus, and she was so tired, she would not go to the back. She sat down in the white-only section where there was a seat, and she was arrested. That move of arresting her gave the black community the opportunity to test these laws of segregation. But more than that, King, on his base of moral authority, called to the blacks of Montgomery, boycott those buses. Boycott them. And he and his friends waited anxiously. And then that next morning came, and those buses went by empty, one after another. Black people walking to their jobs. One man riding in a cart drawn by a mule, showing that they would stand together. And right there, this evil system of segregation began to crumble. It began to crack. Because one man had the courage to lead. Oh, it might have fallen on its own, but this man was there at that point in time. And like his namesake, like Martin Luther himself, King said, I can do nothing else. Here I stand. And so they would march in Selma. They would register voters. They would point out again and again to America how wrong this system was. Not by acts of violence, but by resisting untruth. And so from a jail in Birmingham in 1963, Martin Luther King wrote to white ministers. And he said, I am disappointed in the role that the white church has played. You have allowed evil to be done. And in many ways, the greatest block to achieving the rights for our people are moderate whites who stand by and profess platitudes of goodness, but allow evil to be done. That is exactly what Thoreau had said. The man who votes in an evil government is simply carrying out evil himself. Don't shirk your responsibility. And that is what you whites are doing. Now you might say to me, Martin Luther King, how can you say that you are a good man when you violate the law? And I say to you that a good man must violate an evil law. But who are you to say that a law is evil? And I say to you, Martin Luther King responds in his letter, that a law which violates natural law is wrong. He quotes Thomas Aquinas. An unjust law is not a law, and it is my duty to resist him. It is a letter filled with quotes from Aquinas and Tillich and Niebuhr. A powerful, resounding statement of freedom. And it would resound even more loudly when on August the 28th in 1963, King spoke to 250,000 people gathered in Washington, standing there at the Lincoln Memorial, and began his speech 50 years ago, invoking the Gettysburg Address. This man signed an Emancipation Proclamation, but we still are unfree. America has not redeemed her promise in the Declaration of Independence, invoking those two great documents, America's belief in freedom, and now will America realize it by enfranchising truly its black citizens. And then in the second coming out, having achieved his desire in the Civil Rights Act, he says freedom is not just voting, it's not being poor, and it is standing up against an unjust war in Vietnam. They are wrong, and whatever we have gained in the past will be lost if we don't stand up now and say, this is wrong. War is wrong, and our people must have the economic freedom to enjoy political freedom. And so he would go to Memphis. He didn't want to speak that night, but the crowd was there. They wanted him. And he fed upon the enthusiasm of the crowd and uttered those words that will ring down through history just as much as the Gettysburg Address. He might not get to the promised land, but that we as a people, and I think he means the American people as a whole, will get there. And then, like Lincoln, assassinated. An assassination we still don't understand. But Martin Luther King takes his place right alongside our great martyrs of freedom, going right back to Socrates, an American original, a man of enduring greatness.